So, everyone, welcome to our third episode of Bible Theory. Today, I'm going to cover something a little bit different, but I think I found a good format. I want to talk about something we kind of know about, but we haven't exactly, at least I haven't done a deep dive into a lot of the Bible. But for now, in this video, I want to cover what I discovered about the Philistines, but more specifically, the Philistine priests and diviners mentioned in 1 Samuel chapter 6, verse 2 at the very end. So for some context of when they're introduced, they show up when the Philistines have captured the Ark of the Covenant from the Israelites. They've taken it to one of their temples. They've had plagues. Their statues of their god Dagon have been destroyed, and a lot of bad stuff has come to them ever since they've gotten the Ark of the Covenant. So at this point, they don't want it. They're trying to get rid of it, but they don't know how to do it. So they ask these mysterious priests and diviners mentioned in that verse. And I think this is a question like pretty much no one has ever asked before. And if so, not many people have asked this question before, but I did because I was curious about who these people were. And so I did some research on it. So this is what I found about these Philistine priests and diviners. And I'm going to cover some other things related to their religion just to set some groundwork on that in this video as well. So, first, before we get into exactly who they were and what they specifically did, I wanted to mention what a diviner exactly was. So they would practice, as their name would suggest, divination, I think is how it's pronounced. I've never heard of it before, but so they would practice divination. They're diviners, which basically divination would be seeking knowledge through supernatural means, to put it simply. And of course, these supernatural means would be different for different people. And that's why it's a little bit vague to say diviners. Let's go through the Philistines' story and their culture. So, what the Philistines exactly were they were kind of like Vikings. They were sort of actually more like immigrants. They migrated. For this part of the video, I want to cover what exactly their story was and their culture so that we can understand where they were coming from and what their religion was like in general. And spoiler alert, we don't know exactly what their religion was like. For some reason, there's not a lot of evidence about them, but we do know some of their background. So where they started was actually a tribe called the Philistine. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And they came from what would later become Crete, which, interestingly enough, would later become somewhere known as a very evil place. The Philistine were one of a few tribes that would go from Crete. They would go on to attack Egypt, which of course was a superpower at this point, big, maybe not an empire, but a big nation that was pretty interesting in itself. And I'll bring up Egypt again later. And they would be defeated in their attack on Egypt. I think they used 7 ships, it's recorded, all these different tribes. So after this attack, of course, the Philistine could not stay in Egypt, nor could any of the others. It's believed that the Philistine and a few other tribes went on to become the Philistines. So that's kind of like their origin story. They were immigrants defeated on their conquest, who would settle later on for a land in southeastern Mediterranean coast, otherwise known as the Gaza Strip, and southern Israel, as we would see on a map in modern times. And that's really interesting as well, because in modern times, there is conflict between Israel and their current rival, Palestine. And whatever side you take on that, it doesn't really matter for this video. But it is interesting how the Gaza Strip, as we know it today, goes back in Israel's history very far. So it's interesting stuff, you know what I mean? I should have mentioned this earlier also. They attacked Egypt in the 12th century BCE, as we believe from archaeological finds. Now, what we do know about their religion, recorded in the Bible, is that they believed in polytheism. They had multiple gods that they believed in, that they would worship. And those would be Dagon, who would be similar to Baal in what he did, or what purpose he served in their religion, being he would have been the god of, I believe, grain or wheat or something like that. And Baal from a different religion, I believe, like Babylon, I think, but they would both serve an agricultural purpose, sort of, which is something interesting. And similarly to Baal, there would be Beelzebub, otherwise known as Beelzebub, mentioned in the Queen's song Bohemian Rhapsody, and also the story known as the Lord of the Flies, as Beelzebub translates to the Lord of the Flies, interestingly enough. So he would be a fly god. Also, it's believed that Dagon may have been a fish god, but he was also like wheat or something like that. So he could have been a combined thing. Of course, they were sea people, so it would make sense for them to have some sort of fish-related idol, of course. We do know from 1 Samuel that they did make some offerings to communicate with their gods. I'm sure there was plenty of interesting stuff going on related to what they believed, but quite frankly, I couldn't find a lot on their religion. As we know that it was inspired by surrounding religions, we can find interesting things that could be related to their religion and what they believed in. So, still laying some groundwork. Egyptian religion is some interesting stuff. Okay, so for their priests specifically, because of course priests and diviners, their priests were hierarchy. So there was a whole system. It would start at Pharaoh and it would go down to, I have no idea to pronounce the name, so I'm going to put it up on the screen. It translates to pure. So they had the pure priests, and that's what they were known as. As well as that, there was a lot of stuff in between. They had some who would read the Book of the Dead, and that was their main purpose, and things like that, that they all served a certain purpose. They needed to be well-versed in like medicine, knowing about the stars, and things like that as well, which is really interesting to me, as it shows that they were very educated people as well. An interesting fact about the Egyptian priests is that specifically the pharaoh, during a ritual, would go up before one of the gods, and he would remove his shoes. Because, we know when Moses encounters Yahweh, the one true God, he's told to remove his sandals because he's standing on holy ground. So the Egyptians had somewhat of an understanding of the same concept within their own religion. And maybe when the peoples dispersed after the Tower of Babel, perhaps they carried the same idea from the people who knew the truth. Obviously, over time, cultures developed, things changed. We can find similarities in different cultures. For example, Noah's Ark appears over many different ancient cultures. You can do your own research on it, but it does appear a lot. So now that I've talked about the Egyptian priests, there were some diviners I discovered in from the Greek, Aegean, or I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Mycenaean. They were basically Greek people. And they are the actual people who came from Crete and attacked Egypt and would later become the Philistines, or some of them at least. So the Pelisette would have come from here, as I mentioned them earlier. So ways of divination would be things like trances. They might do a dance or something like that. And certain breathing exercises would happen. So the breathing thing makes me think of like monks, interestingly. So I don't know, but that's something they would do to gain knowledge. They would also watch birds and the weather to find out what the gods were thinking, how they were feeling that day. So they were trying to figure out how their gods, what they were thinking. They're like, hey, how you feeling today? And they would watch the nature around them to find out what they believed was the truth. Obviously, this seems a little bit silly, a little bit weird, but it's what made sense at the time. We need to remember these people lived in a completely different civilization than we did. So, thinking about that, okay, whatever, fine. And they would use it in their culture for war, agriculture, farming, that kind of stuff. The diviners were crucial to that. And we can see how that could kind of be carried over into the Philistine culture, as we know that in order to find out what to do with the Ark of the Covenant, they contacted some priests and diviners to find out what we're going to do with this. And so they asked them. I'm sure that these diviners were doing some of these things, something like it, as they were inspired by those kinds of cultures. So just some things to take into consideration when we're thinking about what it might have been like, what these diviners specifically, because that's the one that really intrigued me the most, what they might have been doing. So, of course, we still don't know the ultimate truth about who they were and what they were doing. We can guess, based off this information, that they may have lived in temples for the priests. They may have performed rituals in public. We know that they held a high cultural and sort of economic, social status within that culture. They were important for their military and for the agriculture, the farmers living, in their society. And finally, they may have understood the one true God, Yahweh, to a certain extent, which is one of the most interesting parts. So that's all I really have to say. This has been an episode of Bible Theory about something you probably never would have expected. I'm answering a question I doubt anyone ever asked, but it is interesting to think about and to read about it. So that's all I really have to say. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Bible Theory. Again, just have a great day. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.